Hey, welcome to the PublishPress podcast. I'm Steve Burge from PublishPress.
And I'm Dan Knaus from Multidots.
And Dan, who are we talking with this week?
This week we talked with Rae Morey. I'm an old fan of the repository. I'm sure many people in the WordPress space are familiar with kind of what's become our default newspaper of record these days in WordPress.
That's a great way to describe it. Every Friday, Rae sends out a newsletter with a wrap-up of everything that's happened in WordPress in the last week or so, complete with the main story, plus quotes from all sorts of different people across the WordPress community. It's really a great newsletter. It's at the repository.email. Sign up now, and then listen to me and Dan talk with Rae. Hey, Rae, welcome. Welcome to the PublishPress podcast.
Thanks, Steve, and nice to see you both as well. You too, Dan?
Yeah, great to catch up again, Rae.
You guys have been on at least one journalism podcast together before, right? Talking about WordPress journalism.
Yeah. WordPress news a couple of years ago with Post Status.
Yeah, back when Sarah Gooding was still at the tavern, and David Bissett organized a roundtable, and we talked WordPress news and curation and journalism in the business of WordPress space.
But that's kind of ironic because, Rae, you've almost taken over that WP tavern space that used to exist, putting out regular high-quality news about WordPress. Right now, we're talking in early 2025, and I think that maybe one of the people who was putting out regular news at the tavern just left. And with the repository, you're now on nearly issue 250. Congratulations.
Yeah. Thank you.
Or it was more. Yeah, it's great.
It feels like more. I was really sad to see Sarah leave WP Tavern. It certainly wasn't my intention to kind of almost dominate this space a little bit with what I'm doing. But with Josna leaving recently as well, it's sad to see that WP Tavern hasn't continued the legacy that Sarah built. So I'm hoping somebody can step back into Sarah and Josna's shoes and take over there. But yeah, at the repository is now at issue 244. That'll be going out this Friday, and it's been quite the journey. It's starting this almost 5 years ago. In November 2019, I've had a few weeks here and there off over Christmas, and just to take some time off, I publish the newsletter weekly every Friday, and try to do it as consistently as possible, but make sure that take some time off because very conscious of burnout.
If someone has not come across the repository before, what will they find? What will they get in their inbox every Friday?
Yeah, so every Friday, the repository is a weekly email newsletter that features a roundup of what's happening across the WordPress ecosystem. So the top of the newsletter features somewhere between 2 and 6 top stories of the week that are a bit more in depth, and then the bottom half is some shout outs to sponsors and some quick hits across what's happening in the space. So the aim is in around 5 to 10 minutes to get a good rundown of what's happening in WordPress.
Yeah, and I think you've consistently had like a little meet someone's personality from the WordPress community too. I really like those, and I think that's consistently in there, right? Like find out what people are reading, what they think, and
not
where
at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah, that's something that we introduced around issue 100, and we're maybe 150 issues. But damn, finding people to actually fill it out is a lot of work. Yeah. People are always excited to be asked, and then I think Topher at HeroPress probably runs into the same issues. People take a lot of time to get back to me with their profiles, or it takes a lot of chasing. It was a lot of work, and so with just me mostly doing the repository, I just kind of left it when around October last year. Something I want to bring back. But
it was great. Yeah. Really like that. Yeah, sign me up to spread the word. I'll send you Canadian Slack. Well, you're in that one too. You're probably in all the news. If I'm sending you a source or an idea, I always feel like you're probably already there. You probably already saw it. So
Try to be everywhere. Yeah.
yeah, and the little tips, little links at the bottom are awesome too. Just end of the newsletter. What's big in little pieces of cool things people have done, little just quick hits, and it's a wonderful package altogether.
Thank you.
So, Rae, can you take us back? How did you get started in this? Have you been a journalist before?
I have, yeah. So probably if I go way back to the beginning, when I was in high school, you come across careers fairs and things like that. When I was in high school, the school that I went to in a little remote mining town in Tasmania at the bottom of Australia, we had a careers fair that featured quite a number of different businesses and careers. There was the Defence Force and local businesses, and the stall that really piqued my interest was the local newspaper. And I was 13 years old, and I thought, oh, okay, I never thought about this before. I was always I was a massive nerd. I was always into stories, and I thought, well, this just works for me. I love talking to people. I love writing. And so from then on, I just always wanted to be a journalist. I went to university and studied journalism, but going back to being a nerd, I also loved computers. So I studied computer science and journalism, and my lecturers at the time thought I was a bit weird. Going back, I don't want to reveal my age really, but yeah, it was a long time ago when, computers weren't the thing for women to be doing. And yeah, I followed the journalism path for my degree and went into news reporting. I worked for Fairfax here in Australia for a little while. Took a break, lived overseas in Japan, where I did a jet program, and I understand you did that too, Steve. Then I came back to live in Melbourne and worked for News Limited over here. Yeah.
I had always assumed that you were from Sydney or Melbourne for some reason, but you're actually from the southern tip of Tasmania, about as far south as it's possible to get.
Pretty much. Yeah, I grew up down in Tassie. In really a remote mining town, and then went to university down in Hobart, right at the bottom of Tasmania. But I live in Melbourne now.
And then onto Fairfax, which is kind of like the biggest sort of journalism media company in Australia.
Yep. One of them. There's Fairfax and also News Limited, the Rupert Murdoch one. I've worked for both.
Yeah, they're two kind of big competing media outlets. I think maybe if you go to like Sydney, they have two competing newspapers, one owned by Fairfax, one owned by the rivals.
In Melbourne, we have The Age, which is Fairfax owned, and the Herald Sun, which is Murdoch owned. News Limited owned, yeah.
So you had a journalism career and also for a few years a technology career as well, right?
Yeah, so after I left News Limited, I went to work for, I decided you kind of get to a point as a journalist where you're not making much money because journalists don't get paid a lot. And I thought maybe it's time to use the computer science part of my degree. And I'd always enjoyed web development. I saw a job advertised at James Farmer's WPMU Dev for a writer. So I applied, and after jumping through lots of rings to get that job, James is pretty tough with hiring, I went to work with him. And interestingly enough, that was where Sarah Gooding was working at the time. And so we worked together for a few months actually before she started WP Tavern. Yeah. So I was with WPMU Dev for around almost 5 years, where I started as a writer. Sarah and I were both writers, and then after she left, continued writing, went on to be managing editor of the blog there.
So you got a good journalism background and a good technology background. How did you end up combining the two to start Repository? What was the gem of the idea?
I guess after a few years at WPME Dev, I'd always thought about working for myself, and I thought, well, I'm going to take the jump and go into working in marketing consulting for myself. So I took that leap, did a lot of content work, but one of my clients at the time was a male poet, and I met Kim Gerstad there. And he's a former journalist as well. I think he worked in the Congo of all places as a journalist. And we just really hit it off as I guess idealists in wanting to see some kind of more objective journalism in the WordPress space. And he had a newsletter business. I was writing, and so we always talked about wanting to start some kind of newsletter. And one day we were like, well, why don't we just do it? I pitched. We thought about lots of different formats, whether we should look at actual investigative journalism or long form journalism. But in the end, we were both running businesses and we didn't have a lot of time. And so I pitched this idea of something very similar to, I don't know if you've heard of the Muckrack Daily email, but they do a fantastic kind of daily roundup of what's happening across the news space. It's very American and a little bit fun as well. What we wanted to do was highlight what was happening in WordPress, but from the idea of what's everybody saying about it. So that was our first kind of go. You can go back and look at issue 1. It's very different from what the newsletter looks like now, but that was the initial idea, just to kind of give people an idea what was happening in the space, drawing from what was already being published. And so we sent out the first issue on the 19th of November 2019. And so that was kind of the start. I wasn't expecting. I thought it would just be like a bit of a weekly fun thing to do, and it's just grown from there.
Oh, so it started off almost on as an experiment, and
it was very much an experiment.
And you started off doing it as a newsletter rather than, say, a blog like WP Tavern, because you were working with Mail Poet at the time, and that's what they were into. They were into newsletters.
Yeah, very much.
That's only about a year or two after Substack launches. So newsletters are kind of becoming a thing for monetizing and doing journalism in that way. I think there's a little burst at that time. Was that on your radar, that had been a trend with Substack launching?
Not really. I guess it was more because I was working with Mail Poet and Kim had this platform already, so we decided to make the most of it. We also wanted to, I guess, show off what Mail Poet could do as well, I guess, because, that was Kim's product. I was already subscribed to so many email newsletters, knew how powerful it could be as far as, having something that's short and sharp that could land in people's inboxes and provide some value in a very private space. As consider email to be somewhere that's very sacred to a lot of people. I know it is to me. You carefully curate who you want in your inbox, whereas something that's, blogs and news sites, WP Tavern was already in the space and there were lots of other sites at the time. And we just wanted something that we could do that was a bit of fun to start with and just see where it went. And we didn't have any grand plans for it at the time. It was just a weekly experiment as we were both doing other work.
What does your process look like? How do you start from Monday morning and end up on Friday with like 5 or 6 big stories and lots of comments and lots of extra small stories? What does your process look like to start with a blank page and 5 days later end up with a big, interesting newsletter?
It kind of starts with I use Apple Notes to kind of duplicate last week's newsletter, and so I've got that kind of skeleton of what the newsletter is going to look like. And I also use Feedly, so I have a couple hundred different websites that I follow that I check what they're doing every day. I kind of check in to see who's publishing what, and then I also keep an eye on lots of Slack channels and servers to see what's going on. Also look at what's happening across Twitter. I follow a lot of people on Twitter and have lists. And these days, Blue Sky, Mastodon. And so across all of those different channels, I can kind of get a good sense of what's happening. So I just kind of pick kind of open up everything and have it's a lot of reading throughout and curation throughout the week just to see what's going on and keeping tabs on everything. So just getting an idea of what's happening, I can kind of, because I've been doing this for so long and because I'm a trained journalist as well, I can kind of quickly pick up on what are the most important stories that are going on, what do I need to keep an eye on that's developing, and what's kind of the smaller news that I can put down the bottom half of the newsletter. Amongst all of that, there are people who often give me tip-offs across the community to let me know what I might need to keep an eye on. So I've developed, sorry.
Just people like Dan.
Yeah. Well, Dan, I've spoken to Dan before.
You probably feel spammed by all the.
No, I appreciate messages from everybody. Because I've been doing this for a while, and I guess because, especially since October, I've been I moved to publishing news on the repository website. A lot of people get in touch when they think that something might be a developing story or something that I should put my attention to, which is really helpful for me because I don't know everything. I don't pretend to know everything, I don't think. And it's I can only be as informed as everybody else in the community. So it's really helpful when people get in touch. And I should mention, I do have a news tip-off page on my website for anybody who does want to reach out with tip-offs. And I'm on Signal as well. So there have been instances where people have approached me with stories and people have spoken to me anonymously. And, I treat that with enormous sensitivity because people who come forward and give tip-offs deserve a lot of credit.
So now the repository has grown, you find a lot of the news is coming to you rather than you having to go and seek it out? I know maybe a few years ago when I was launching a product, the first place I would go would be the WP Tavern contact form. But now it feels like it might be the repository instead. You find it a little bit easier to get stories nowadays?
That's an interesting question. Yes and no. I think the expectations are certainly higher around what I should be publishing. I mean, five years ago when I was putting out the newsletter, it was just me kind of gathering links and writing what I thought was the news. It was very much me. But now that I have a bigger audience and the WP Tavern isn't dominating the space so much, and also because I've published some kind of big stories in the last few months, there's definitely an expectation that people who subscribe or read the repository are going to get high quality news. As much as me going out and looking for stories, I think it's a bit of maybe 50-50 almost. People coming, well, don't know if maybe it's 50-50, but yeah, there's a lot of people who are coming to me with stories as well as me kind of, like with journalism, it's not just people approaching you, but nurturing contacts and gathering people's trust is a big part of that. People need to know that they can trust you with their stories. So there is a lot of reach out on my end because I'm still, I wouldn't say I'm super established in this space yet. There are a lot of people who haven't come across the repository before who are still learning that or discovering that the repository is here. And so there is still a lot of work on my end. And I imagine there will be for forever.
Yeah, you've done some substantial journalism in the WordPress space, broken some big stories about things happening around Automatic, for example. Over the last 4 or 5 years you've been doing this, have any of those stories been inflection points for the repository where after you've broken a story or written about a particular topic, have you seen your subscribers take a big leap and you've said, okay, that's added another 300, 400 people to my list?
Yeah, I guess especially in recent months with, all of the drama that's been going on with WP Engine and Automatic and Matt Mullenweg, there's definitely been, and also because since October I decided to start publishing longer form news after, it was just funny timing really because I wasn't planning to, my plan in August, September was to start planning longer form news on the repository website and not just be a newsletter. And so I went off to Germany and France for a family holiday for 4 weeks. And my plan at the end of September, October was to jump into reporting. And it was the last week of my overseas holiday when I saw what had happened at WordCamp US. And I thought, oh God, next week's going to be interesting, getting back into work. And so I guess in October, my first story back after holidays when I was trying to catch up on everything that was going on was an interview that I had with Matt Mullenweg. I asked him, where is this going? How do you see this ending? And he made the comment about taking over WP Engine, and that blew up as a big story and has been included in WP Engine's court filings as evidence. I guess in November and December, also stories about core committers and core contributors anonymously signing a letter, that open letter asking for Matt to work with the community. That was a pretty big story that blew up as well. And interestingly, I published a story, what was that, start of the year, about the sustainability team being shut down, and that was actually the most read story ever published on the repository website. Which I was quite heartened by, that people that people are really interested in sustainability and were just shocked by what had happened. That was more than double the traffic of any other story I've had by a long shot. So
Do you mind me asking you about the business side of this? That you've had some big successful stories, you've been slowly nurturing this, and it sounds as if you've made a decision to kickstart some areas of the business by publishing longer form, publishing online. Is this something that is a business you're building that could be a full-time job for you? Do you mind talking a little bit about the business side of the repository?
Yeah, for sure. It is my full-time job at the moment. When I was working in local government up until June, and I kind of had to make a decision about. I was offered a ongoing permanent full-time job for local government, and at the time I wasn't loving it, and I was also spending with WP Tavern essentially shutting down after Sarah left. I was finding myself writing longer and longer stories to try and fill in the context of what was happening. So the newsletter was getting long and people weren't loving it, and I had nothing to link to because Sarah wasn't around. So I kind of had to make a decision. Do I just not publish the repository anymore, or do I go all in and just see where that goes and grow it as a business? So I made after going to WordCamp Asia, especially last year, and just the feedback I was getting from people, I decided, okay, I'm gonna give this a shot and see how it goes. So in July and August, I kind of did a bit of freelance work to kind of tie up loose ends, and then went on my holiday in Europe. And the plan was to jump all in October and see how grow the business. But October ended up being a pretty crazy month with everything going on, and also trying to have conversations with sponsors at the same time. So the idea was that I'm working on this full time at the moment, and so trying to work on the business side of things.
And Dan, you got a couple of questions in this area too, right?
Yeah. I think on the business side, so there's one sponsor per issue generally, and you have like a dedicated patron then for each issue. Is that a good model that has worked so far, or have you experimented with other things?
Yeah, it's definitely something. It's definitely a work in progress. Since the newsletter started, it's been, I've had a major sponsor for the newsletter. Initially, it was Mail Poet who was backing it financially. Then over time, GoDaddy stepped in for a couple of years in the early years to sponsor. So I'm very grateful. They really helped with the early foundation building of the newsletter. So I've continued that model with having one major newsletter sponsor, and in the past few months, since October, I've introduced community sponsors to try and build more revenue, and also to fund the news reporting on the website. So there's one newsletter sponsor. I'm aiming for up to 10 community sponsors at the moment. I'm halfway there right now. So looking for more sponsors if anyone's interested. And on the repository website, I have display advertising as well. That's the revenue model at the moment as far as sponsorship goes. I also have fundjournalism.org account set up. So if any individual supporters want to support what I'm doing with independent journalism, they can certainly do that. And I do have several individual supporters at the moment. So I'm very grateful for their support. Supporters can contribute monthly or annually with a subscription. So there are a couple of different revenue models I'm working with at the moment, and just kind of seeing how that goes. It's definitely experiment trying to figure out how people want to support journalism in the WordPress space. As far as, a lot of people want it and appreciate it, but I spend a lot of time on trying to find sponsorship, and I'd rather be writing and not doing that. So it can be quite it's a challenge trying to fund this kind of model because, as we've seen in the wider just general space, journalism is really hard to get funding for.
Have you been kicking around any potential other ideas, such as a private community or a podcast that people could sponsor or YouTube videos? Have you kicked around any other alternatives beyond sponsorship?
Yeah, I've entertained other ideas, but it's really at the moment what I have time for because it's hard to keep up like the level of quality in the newsletter and then the newsletter and also the reporting during the week, as well as, looking at other kinds of things, content to create that I don't really have the time to do at the moment. So I'm looking at I'm also looking into a sponsored editorial at the moment where companies can publish advertorials on the repository website. When I did the repository annual survey last year, feedback from people who took part in that survey was that if there was advertising in the repository, they would like to see how-tos and educational content provided by sponsors. And that was the top option ahead of sponsored content written by me or videos or podcasts or, social media and other kinds of things. So I found that really interesting that people just want to see straight up content from companies. But I get it. You see a lot of reviews on websites. People just want to see content that shows them how to do something or answers a question for them. That's high quality. So that's something that I'm exploring at the moment as well. But also keeping in mind that I don't want to dilute the news content that's on the website.
Like that. It sounds as if.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that before. It's an interesting model. I was going to ask if you've had much interest from potential advertisers, sponsors, kind of adjacent to the WordPress space, other web tech or other areas that aren't traditionally thought of as all WordPress brands. It's kind of a bubble we're in. So does going outside that seem like a possibility with advertisers?
Yeah, it's definitely a possibility, something that I haven't really explored yet because the repository in its current form with the news on the website is still fairly new. Hasn't even hit 6 months yet. So definitely something I'm open to because I know that it's also an interesting space at the moment because the instability that's happening in WordPress as far as the court case. In October when I was launching all this, I wasn't sure what was going to happen. I wasn't sure. Should I just continue doing this? Is this business model going to work? Is anyone going to want to fund it? Because I think initially a lot of companies, when I approached to talk about sponsorship, were all just holding onto their wallets really tightly because they were waiting to see what was going to happen. And I was emerging as a news business that was, people were really hesitant about picking sides, and I'm not trying to pick sides. I'm just trying to report on what's happening. And I think companies have loosened up a little bit now that they know that, okay, this isn't something that's going to be resolved overnight. We just need to get on with what we're doing. And so I've been able to lock in sponsorships. But as far as companies that are outside WordPress, I'm still kind of figuring out where they're at the moment because, in in past years we've seen companies, the one that comes to mind is OmniSeams, that's come more into this space and has been willing to advertise. But I haven't seen, maybe it's just not what I'm seeing, but a lot of other companies like willingly trying to come into the WordPress ecosystem the way that they have. So it's definitely something I'm kind of keeping an eye on, and it'd be interesting to see what companies are willing to step into this space at the moment.
Yeah, I was noticing on W3 Tech's data that some hosting companies have far more of a WordPress investment in, or a stake than I realized, and they don't always act that way. Like DigitalOcean, I assumed a large portion was WordPress, but it's, I think, really very large. But they're going through some changes in their content marketing as well. But yeah, maybe there's some opportunities like that with some of those who haven't really traditionally focused on their marketing or their brand as a WordPress company.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another way to look at it is the repository is not a WordPress specific brand name. If you're successful enough, there could be a repository newsletter for different topics as well.
Yeah, that's definitely something I've had in mind. As far as covering other, I'd really love to move into covering other open source communities. At the moment, it's WordPress, but covering other open source would probably require more than just me. I can't keep an eye on everything. So I think, if I'm able to build a small team, that's definitely something that I would be looking into, because there's lots going on with Drupal at the moment, and other communities. And I think it would be really healthy for the WordPress community to just see what's happening in other spaces, and to get outside the bubble, because there, other communities work in different ways. A lot of people in the WordPress community aren't aware of how they operate, and I think that would be just a good thing. But for now, it's not something that I'm kind of have the capabilities to do.
It sounds as if,
I should say.
it certainly sounds as if writing the newsletter and doing sponsorships is at least a full-time job in itself right now.
It is, yeah.
The Matt and the automatic story seems to have been both a boon for the newsletter, but also perhaps a challenge as well. Have you had to be very careful? Are these the kinds of stories that you proofread like 4 or 5 times before you finally hit publish?
Yeah. I guess I think a lot of the people who did the so-called Hunger Games for WP Tavern would have understood what it was like to hit publish on a story that a lot of people are going to read. I think I've had the experience in the past of having front page stories in newspapers, so I'm not so. And I used to report on politics when I lived down in Tasmania, and I'd get, if there was a particular politician who didn't like a story I'd written, their media advisor would be on the phone yelling at me. So I guess I've got a thick skin from those experiences. They were very formative in my 20s, and I think because I've been writing and reporting for a long time, and I use a lot of tools, like Grammarly. I've hired a proofreader, and so I've got these kinds of mechanisms in place to make sure that I'm not writing anything that's and just having that the journalism training to know that I'm not writing anything that's going to be defaming, those kinds of things. Like you learn a lot when you work as a journalist and when you study journalism to know that what's right to report and what's not. It's really hard to put into words. You just kind of know because you trained. Yeah.
So this is far from your first time of writing content, of breaking stories that are getting in front of powerful people. You've had front page stories, you've had stories that have got the attention of politicians before. This is far from your first radio.
Yeah. It's where I'm from in Tasmania. Forestry is a pretty big thing. Tasmania is a home of where the Greens Party started in the world. So a lot of the stories I was writing down there regarding politics had a lot to do with forestry. What was happening politically at the time. So I've had experience dealing with contentious issues, and so I learned pretty early on as a young journalist how to navigate, big personalities. And I think at the end of the day, we're all just people. It's easy to kind of get a bit kind of starstruck dealing with some people, but I think those kind of formative experiences, just having lunch with politicians or just seeing the very day-to-day, very human things that they do kind of stuck with me. And so I think it's important just to remember that when you're reporting that, we're all humans.
So I've got a couple of closing questions, if I can. One is a pitch for you. What are ways in which people can support the repository? If they're listening to this, they can go and sign up to the newsletter. What else can they do to help you out?
Yeah, especially. Yeah, like I would add to that too, the readers, so like people who really like what you're doing, but they're maybe not in a position to be advertisers. What can your fans do to support the news?
Well, I guess they can be like Dan and send you story tips.
Yeah. I guess sign up to the newsletter. I do a little happy dance every time I see somebody sign up. It's really good it helps me with approaching sponsors to have a large number of subscribers, obviously. And people support in all kinds of different ways, from subscribing to just reading the stories, sharing links and sharing the newsletter to other people is really helpful. I just love feedback from people as well. I can be reached. Anyone can reach out to me. I'm on. If you go to the repository website, it's therepository.email. You can reach me via the contact form or email via the site. I'm also I'm kind of everywhere. WordPress, Slack, Post Status Slack, Blue Sky, Mastodon, X. Yeah. Tip-offs are great. Subscribe. Yeah, there's lots of different ways to support what I'm doing.
Cool. So basically, sponsor if you can, sign up and get other people to sign up, and send you some tips as well.
Yep. And also individual supporters if they want to help fund journalism as well.
Cool. At the end of every podcast, we ask the publishers that we're talking to if they've seen one publisher lately that is really interesting to them. What's one publisher that has really been putting out good work lately that you've bookmarked or whose newsletter you always read?
Someone I've been following lately that I think is doing some great content is Brian Courts. I hope I'm saying his name right. I haven't met him, but I follow him quite a lot. He's doing a fantastic podcast with webmasters.fm, and just his articles and blog content are just, really thoughtful. I like the perspective he has on things. He's not trying to be inflammatory or scandalous, but he has a considered way of approaching topics in the WordPress space, and I think he's a good one to follow.
So Brian is a specifically WordPress writer, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when did quite a lot, did some great interviews with Matt Mullenweg and others when he was writing for Master WP, but definitely has strong journalist and writing abilities, humanities background, and a great developer. So he always seems to go right to the heart of what he thinks is something important others aren't talking about or getting quite right, maybe. And he's really good at that. Always worth reading. I totally agree.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Rae. I wish you all the best for the next 5 years of the repository.
And another 5 years sounds like a long time. Thank you so much, Steve, and thanks, Dan.
Well, I wish you good luck this year, and I hope your growth continues. And if you're listening and you haven't signed up yet, head over to therepository.email.